Welcome to More Than Just a Veteran podcast. More Than Just a Veteran seeks to share empowering real-life accounts from our beloved military men and women. Our mission is to pay them the utmost respect for their sacrifices through our podcast and heroic stories. We don't want to send the MP to your barracks, so go ahead and click subscribe to our channel on the double. And now, without further ado, here is the Chief of Operations, Katrina Presco.
Welcome to More Than Just a Veteran. This is Kat Presco, and I am very honored to have a very special author with us here today, David Davis, who is the author of Wheels of Courage. Good afternoon there, David. How are you?
Good, Kat. Nice sunny day here in Los Angeles. How are you doing?
Well, it's a little cold, but it's not too bad here in the Lake of the Ozarks. So, but I'll dream of your wonderful sunshine weather there in California.
Right.
I recently saw David's work on another podcast, and being passionate about the World War II era myself, I was really fascinated by his book, and his book, Wheels of Courage. I'm going to let him tell it more in depth because obviously he knows it better than me. But it's a very inspiring story. And so first, though, we're going to start with David's introduction. So, David, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Kat. And again, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I'm born and raised in New York City. I went to college back east in upstate New York, so I know all about cold weather. Came out to California in 1986 and started working in journalism about then. For a local newspaper here, and then transitioned to being a freelance writer and writing books. And the subject has always been what I call the culture of sports, not so much concerned about who won the game or so forth, even though that's very exciting, as last weekend's football game showed. But it's more about trying to find stories that maybe fell through the cracks, aren't as well known as other stories or athletes. And so that's sort of where I do my, I think, best work. And that's sort of what led me to Wheels of Courage, my latest book. A previous book I had written, I had done some research that led me to sort of the beginning of the story of Wheels of Courage, which, for those of you who are just tuning in, it's basically the origin story of sports for people with disability. And those of you may know the Paralympics. And honestly, this is the origin story of the Paralympics. And I'm a huge scholar of and historian of the Olympics. I've been to 10 or 12 of them personally. And I've written about them. My previous books have been about the Olympics. But honestly, I never really had gone into the Paralympics story. Not for lack of interest, just it hadn't really occurred to me sort of how it started. I just assumed, hey, there were always sports for those who, are in wheelchairs or maybe amputees or whatever. So that was frankly my ignorance. And I came to find out that really the origin of sports for people with disability in the modern era started with World War II veterans, both here in the United States and in England. And you sort of had these two efforts going on at the same time to bring about sports and recreation for disabled veterans, and in particular, those who were paralyzed in battle. And it was part of their rehabilitation. And so that's the basis of the book. And I follow, certainly in the beginning, 3 veterans and tell their stories of how they were wounded in battle in World War II, and then trace how when they came back to the States and were rehabbing in the VA hospitals here, how that became the origin story of first wheelchair basketball here in the United States, and then wheelchair sports in general. Yeah, and so here's the book, Wheels of Courage: How Paralyzed Veterans from World War II Invented Wheelchair Sports, Fought for Disability Rights, and Inspired a Nation. And the book jacket cover, that's from a game in 1947 with veterans from a naval hospital out here in Southern California. Wow. So, like I said, I centered the beginning of the story on three veterans, and in part because they sort of told different stories. In other words, in battle and then afterwards. This is Stan Den Adele, who was a young man. His family ended up in the Bay Area in California. He was studying to be a forest ranger when World War II happened. He was then put into the Army Specialized Training Program, which was a short-lived program for in colleges across America. And then when the U.S. was sort of getting desperate for young men, they disbanded that program. Stan Den Adele ended up in the 11th Armored Division, and in early 45. He went over to Europe and was involved in the Battle of the Bulge. And Stan Den Adele was wounded. He was shot in the back at Germany-Austria border as they were sort of rolling up on the Germans towards the end of the war. Just in the last days of the war, unfortunately, he was shot in the back. He was evacuated. He wrote about his evacuation. It was a desperate time. It took him days and days, and here he is wounded on a leader. And I'll go into some of the medical stuff a little later, but he was very fortunate to be alive, and he was eventually transported back to the States and ended up in a hospital in California, and eventually in Southern California, the Birmingham VA hospital. And I'll talk a little bit more about that Birmingham VA hospital because some of you may know that was one of the first wheelchair basketball teams, and Stan Den Adele was on that team. Wow. So he was a very important cog, and he was one of the first also to do a lot of training with the rehab in terms of showing the world. They would, because his rehab was so successful, doctors would bring him to conventions to show that those in wheelchairs and those with paraplegia could have a full life. Right. And he was one of those. So that's Stan Den Adele. This is John Winterhaller on the right with his fiancee at the time. They did eventually get married and had a long life together. They were both students at the University of Wyoming. That's where this photo was taken. And John Winterhaller was quite an amazing athlete as a youth. He was a star athlete at the University of Wyoming. He played basketball, football, baseball. There were many who considered that he might have a pro career. He was from a family of, I think, 22 or 24 kids. Wow. So it was this huge family. He didn't have a lot of financial resources at the time. He enrolled as an ROTC student so that helped pay for his education. What's really interesting to me about John Winterhaller, and I'm a casual student of history and World War II, but I really didn't in my past read a lot about or know a lot about the early campaigns in the Philippines. And John Winterhaller was part of that. After he came out of officer training, he was with the 1st Separate Marine Division, and he was dispatched to the Philippines in February of 1941. So many months before the war broke out after Pearl Harbor. And his job at the time was to help train the Philippine troops to get up to muster as a defense against the Japanese. Of course, we know what happened after Pearl Harbor and bombing of Philippines by the Japanese, and John eventually was captured on Corregidor, which of course is a famous battle from early 1942. As you can see, I mean, just a healthy athlete. Unfortunately, he was put in Japanese POW camps for basically the duration of the war. And some of you readers may, or some of you viewers may know, Davao Penal Colony, Cabanatuan.
Wow.
He was in Manila at Bilibid, the prison. He was on some of the hell ships, what they called hell ships,
Right.
where Japanese would move around the prisoners. And I mean, he saw just hellacious conditions. And unfortunately, that's how he was rendered paralyzed. Lack of nutrition, starvation diet, basically, and lack of medical care in the camps, in the POW camps. And so John, when he ended up at that last stage in Manila, was rendered paralyzed. He lost the use of his legs, and eventually was transported in early 1945 after the U.S. had finally rolled up the Philippines, and MacArthur returned, and eventually John was brought back to the States. And he did marry, this was his high school sweetheart, college sweetheart, and she stuck with him and married while he was in his hospital bed. And John ended up at the Naval Hospital Corona, which is about 50 miles east of downtown Los Angeles. So that's John Winterhaller. And then the last gentleman, sort of the baby face here, Gene Jerry Fessenmeyer. And he was born and raised in Iowa, Shambaugh, Iowa. His jobs as a kid just helped with the farm, and lived in a really small town. When Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, he was still underage. He eventually, when I think he was still 17, when he graduated from high school, he told me he bounded off the stage, got on a Trailways bus, and went to training in Camp Pendleton here in Southern California.
Yeah.
And he joined the Marines. He was with the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Marine Division. And I should note, he was the only one of the 3 veterans who I was able to meet face to face and talk with. John Winterhaller and Stan Denadell had passed away. So I was able to do research with them through their families, who had letters and pictures and so forth. Gene, Jerry, he went by both names, was still alive. And I was able to visit him face to face in Texas at his home. And then we would talk on the phone all the time.
Wow.
And yeah, I was very fortunate. And honestly, he was really the inspiration for the book. In other words, when I first ran into this as a story, as a journalist, I wrote a story for Los Angeles Magazine out here. But when I went to visit him and started talking with him, that's when I said, okay, this is bigger than just an article.
Wow.
This is a book. And this is a book, hopefully also to, pay tribute to what their sacrifice that they made and what they had overcome in their lives.
Absolutely.
So this is, of course, his early, he's maybe 18 years old. He told me that he was basically cannon fodder. He was being trained for the invasion of Japan, if it had come to that. And he was involved in the last sort of great battle of the Pacific, which was Okinawa. And Gene was trained to carry a bar, the Browning automatic rifle. That was what he went to battle with. The conditions were just atrocious on Okinawa.
Wow.
He was around the Naha Castle. He spotted a Japanese sniper in a tree, and as he basically said, I just didn't get him in time, and the sniper shot him, and he was rendered paralyzed there. And he, again, lucky to be alive, and he was taken back to, at the time they had some surgical tents on the beach, so they did initial surgery there. Then he was taken to a hospital ship that was right off the island there, and started his recovery there. Though, as he told me, and as I relate in the book, it was just an absolute nightmare. And so that's basically a sketch of, a brief sketch of their lives and how they were wounded. And what needs to be emphasized, and what becomes a big part of the book, is, so these guys were super lucky. There were about 2,500 U.S. Paralyzed veterans who survived and were able to return home. And that was the good news. Okay. And when I say good news, it was in comparison to World War I, and even before that, and even in the 20s and into the 30s. If you were a paraplegic, you were basically considered by the medical community a dead ender and a no-hoper. And by that, they meant they really didn't have anything they could do medically to help you. There was no penicillin back then. There were no such thing as exercise. You were put in a full body cast often, which is sort of the worst thing that you could do. As I said, no antibiotics or anything. Really, a lot of the deaths weren't necessarily from the initial wound or injury. It was from sepsis or disease and infection that would come in, if you had a body sore, a bed sore. That, unfortunately, that was the leading cause of death. And I think it was estimated out of World War I, about 80% or more of those who were paraplegics and were home, they lasted about a year to 18 months. That was about it. That was the lifespan. And those who survived, who were, fortunate, lucky, however, beat the lot, won the lottery, well, their lot wasn't so great either. They were often stuck into institutions, or they were at home, if you had maybe a wealthy family or someone with room. And part of that was, and I'll get to the next slide and start showing this. I don't want to dwell too much on the medical. That is, you can take a look at, these are the wheelchairs back then, which are, all of which is to say, incredibly heavy, incredibly clunky, and you couldn't, for instance, a veteran couldn't just roll out with this to a vehicle and somehow get into the car or a bus. There were no such things as kneeling buses back then, curb cutouts, handicap parking. Our society back then, and we can talk about what it's like now later, but our society was very ill-equipped to handle this type of injury. And so it really was not a great future. And here's another shot, and you can see the wheelchair here. Of course, this is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, as a youth in the early 1920s, as he was just starting out as a politician, contracted polio and was basically confined to a wheelchair. Now, Roosevelt's family was very wealthy. He had the best medical care. He took a lot of time to rehab, but still he could not walk unaided without heavy, heavy braces. And he usually had his son or an aide next to him to give him some support. So that's what that's what these men were coming home to. In other words, they were to use a term that gets bandied about now, they were unicorns. Society really had never had to deal with this many, and to go, well, what are we going to do with these guys? And there was a certain urgency to make them better. Again, some of the good news was about American society. They really cared about the veterans. Those of you who know World War II, everybody in America was involved in World War II, even if you were here.
Yeah.
You knew somebody, your neighbor, your brother, your cousin was fighting. Even if you were home, you had a victory garden, or you were, saving all your aluminum foil for the war effort. That kind of thing. So there was in a very positive way, an outpouring of concern, compassion for these veterans. And that was Roosevelt before he died, and then Truman after he took over, really emphasized trying to build up the VA and the VA hospitals. And so that's sort of the next stage. Here you have the second from left is a doctor named Donald Monroe. And he was one of the first at Boston General Hospital in the 30s, just before the war. He had done really the first full scale, and it was on a very small scale, but rehab for paralyzed individuals. And here he is, at that stage. So why did these guys, Stan Dendell and Jerry Fessenmeyer and Johnny Winterholler, survive? Well, several reasons, and I'll get to the rehab in a second with Dr. Monroe, but they had penicillin, which is invented in the 30s, and with the war effort, a lot is out there. There were sulfa drugs on the battlefield that they could use, medics could use to staunch the wounds right away. They had much faster evacuation from the battlefield. And as they learned over the years, and we're still learning a lot about paraplegia, but the sooner that you get care and rehab and so forth, the better off your outcome will be. Mm-hmm. So that's very important. Think about, World War I, you would have to have taken a ship home, from Europe. With, aviation being what it was, you could be home it takes a lot longer than it does, of course, but you could be home within 24 hours if you were, flying on the plane. They usually go to Newfoundland and so forth, but you would get home. And same with the Pacific, you'd go to Hawaii and then to the mainland. The other thing is, and you'll see this later with some of the wheelchair basketball, those wheelchairs, those old wheelchairs that I showed you before, well, now we have modern wheelchairs. These were invented in the 30s, late 30s, early 40s. They're called Everest and Jennings. That's the brand name. They're still around, E&Js. And if you talk to veterans and so forth, they'll start chuckling because that was the default wheelchair. And those were invented by one gentleman who had suffered paraplegia in a mining accident, and he was an engineer. He couldn't get a job because he couldn't leave the house with those old wheelchairs. Mm. So he, along with another engineer, invented one that was foldable, and it was lightweight aluminum. So it weighed about 45, 50 pounds, which today is a lot, but back then was less than half of those old, those were big oak wood wheelchairs. And they were designed to fold so that veterans could wheel themselves from their beds in the VA hospitals to their cars, which had adaptive hand controls. So, for accelerating and brake, they could fold up the wheelchair, put it in the back seat, and move on their way and have a life. Go look for a job, go socialize, go visit family, that sort of thing.
Right.
So Dr. Monroe's approach, so you've got these men surviving. What are you going to do with them again? That's the question. His way of treating it medically was to, as you see the nurse there and this other doctor there, you treat holistically, basically, treat the whole body. He invented a bed, a turning bed, so that you wouldn't have bed sores, so that the men were changed. Each wound is so different with paraplegia, whether it's upper, if it's in the neck or the middle or down below. So you have to be adaptable to what the individual patient's needs are. So that was also very important. And they also recognized that they're going to live maybe a normal lifespan, which had never happened before. So they don't want to keep these men in hospital beds for the next 50 years. That would, first of all, be an incredible cost to society and to the nation. But also, these are young men, and 25. They've just been wounded. They've just had their lives, altered permanently. You have to give them something to look forward to, whether it's a job, whether it's a sports team, something. So that's what they started to concentrate on with the rehab. Let's get these men up. This is a gentleman, Dr. Ernest Boers, who took over. Same thing. Let's do rehab. Let's get these men up and moving and treat the patient individually. And, it was sort of a teamwork with the medical doctors who sort of got it, and the veterans who understood that maybe it was sort of a tough love, like, hey, come on, you're going to get up and you're going to do these exercises. But they also recognized the value of that. This gentleman is Dr. Ludwig Gutmann. He was doing the same thing in England with wounded veterans, whether they were British or Canadian maybe, or South African. And at his hospital, which was called the Stoke Mandeville Hospital, Dr. Gutmann, same principle as Dr. Monroe and Dr. Boers. And the idea was, hey, let's get them up. He has them playing or shooting archery. That was his exercise for the men. And if you think about it, if you've lost the use of your legs because of paraplegia, well, the upper body is going to take over a lot of chores, whether it's wheeling or moving around. So you want to have a strong base, core, shoulders, arms. And so archery is a great exercise for that. And Dr. Gutmann, as we'll show later as well, he is the first to think about what we now know as the Paralympics. And he starts in 1948 in the shadows of the London Olympics, and he's right by near the stadium. He does the first competition in England. So he's quite well known in the Paralympics. Again, I write about what he did because you have to. He was an amazing gentleman. He escaped the Nazis. He was a Jewish doctor who escaped the Nazis right before the war, ended up in England, and went all over the world teaching physicians about paraplegia and that it was not a dead end or a no hoper. So here's a photo of some of the rehab. And again, this didn't exist before World War II. But here you are trying to build up your upper body and arms, because you need that to pivot out of bed, to do other things, wheeling your wheelchair, etc. And they had a whole litany of exercises that the men would do. It was 90 to 100 exercises just to show that they can progress and then eventually leave the hospital. So I'm going to transition to the other modes of rehabilitation, which was exercise, and by that also competition. And I mentioned what Dr. Gutmann was doing in England with archery and getting the men up. This is Bob Reinierson, and he was the assistant athletic director at Birmingham VA Hospital after the war. And Bob was able-bodied, and he noticed at the gymnasium at Birmingham, he would organize pickup basketball games and organize games against other teams. But he noticed afterwards that the men in wheelchairs from the paraplegia wards in the hospital, and it was a separate ward just for the paraplegics, they would sort of wheel their chairs onto the basketball court and, sort of shoot around and pass the ball a little bit. And it struck him. He was a son of a coach. He was a basketball player and coach as well. And it struck him that this might be something to pique the men's interest. And he looked at, and it was sort of interesting because you think of basketball, it's a tall person's sport, right? Mm-hmm. You got the 10-foot high rim and net, and you want to be as high as you can when you shoot. But he noticed that the configuration of the basketball court, the fact that it was flat, smooth, so you could wheel your E&J chair and pivot it and move it around, right, which you couldn't do like on a field or dirt, right. And they tried football and they tried baseball and volleyball, and they worked to a certain degree, but it wasn't this sort of free flowing, moving and jostling. And as I said, a lot of these are young men that he's dealing with. These are young men who maybe played high school sports, college sports, and now they're back. Their life is again permanently altered. Maybe they could want to play basketball. So he started a team at Birmingham, and it's known as either the first or the second. There's still a little discrepancy on that, and it's really hard to prove after all these years. Everybody basically has passed away at this point, but definitely one of the first, and Bob Reinierson was the first to write the rules of wheelchair basketball. And before I go into that, I'll just show you, that's Reinierson as a referee. And here are some of his patients at Birmingham Hospital. And Stan Denadell is the second from the left, you'll see. And this is in the gymnasium. This is an early scrimmage. And those, you can now look at the wheelchairs. Those are the E&Js. You can see the difference from those old ones. Right. The big wheels are in the back and the little wheels are in the front. That was changed from the old models. And this gave them stability, but also you could pivot and move around, that sort of thing. And right. Eventually, over the years, the athletes themselves would, design and build more adaptable wheelchairs for specific sports. Excuse me. So one other thing a couple things I wanted to point out here. It's an old school gym. You can see the basket in the back. That's, from the side. But an early an early argument about the sport of wheelchair basketball was, well, maybe we should lower the rim for these men because they're, in these wheelchairs. It's really hard to, shoot it up there. And they also talked about moving the free throw line closer to the basket. Again, same principles. Very hard to just shoot. I mean, think about basketball. You need your legs to jump, to run, to pivot. Yep. And you don't have that anymore. So it's very, in terms of research for the book, I went out in a modern wheelchair, and tried to shoot, and it's very, very difficult. But the veterans were adamant. They did not want the rim lowered. They did not want the free throw line moved up. And it was an important early decision because, first of all, I think when we now see the modern game, it works fine. But also, it was very much about self-empowerment, I think, for the veterans. Absolutely. And that's sort of a theme that runs throughout, that these men sort of literally got themselves off the canvas, and with help from the doctors and the physical therapists and so forth, they got themselves off the campus and sort of grabbed that second chance of life. And not to be grim about it, but look, they had been in battle. They had seen their friends and comrades,
Right.
killed, etc., maimed, and in some ways they considered themselves lucky that they were alive and they had a chance at this second life, thanks to medicine and penicillin and all these things.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what the heck? This is fun. I mean, this is fun to go out and play ball. It's what we do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's really where it starts. And how it got beyond that is also an incredible story, I think. Here's just another shot at the pool. And that's Stan Denadell, who's you can see smiling. So it's another way. But, this Birmingham hospital, it's in Van Nuys, California. For those of you who don't know, it's in the San Fernando Valley. And that's fairly near some of the movie studios. So a lot of the celebrities and stars used to come visit. That was, considered regular visits to check out the veterans, see how they're doing. They raised money to build this pool for the veterans. And it's still there. And that basketball court is still there, by the way, too.
Wonderful.
It's now a school, but that's still around. So this recreation was really a big part of the rehab for many of these veterans. And, once it started at Birmingham, it sort of spread throughout the other VA hospitals where there were paraplegia wards. And I think there were 7 or 8 VA hospitals around the nation, one in Chicago area, one in Boston area, a couple, 2, 3 in New York, one in Memphis, that had these paraplegia wards. And sort of through the grapevine of this paraplegia, these veterans, hey, check out wheelchair basketball. It's really fun.
Yeah.
And at the same time as that's happening with these paralyzed veterans, again, starting at Birmingham and sort of moving out, they organized themselves together and formed an organization called the Paralyzed Veterans of America, PVA, still exists today and still going strong. A lot of leadership and lobbying and so forth that they do. And of course, outreach to veterans who need care. So it was sort of through this informal grapevine that the sport began to spread. And once it did, these guys from Birmingham said, hey, they're out there. We'd like to play other teams, because really what they were doing in the beginning is they would play other able-bodied teams who would borrow wheelchairs for the occasion. And they did these as exhibitions, in part to raise money for the PVA. But it was sort of the only way they could get a competitive game. And of course they would win because, they were adept at moving the wheelchairs around and, had practiced and so forth. But it was still fun because, hey, they're beating these guys up or the other teams up, but they wanted to play their peers. So they organized in 1947 a barnstorming tour.
Wow.
And again, you can see these are the veterans from Birmingham. Let's see, Stan Denadell is the third from right among those in the wheelchairs. You'll notice that there's one woman in this photo. She's the nurse. Well, let's just say Stan Denadell and Peg started dating after this trip, and they eventually got married. And lived happily ever after in the San Fernando Valley. Quite a few, as a matter of fact, quite a few veterans, as I found out, paralyzed veterans, ended up marrying nurses. over the years. And certainly both sides sort of knew what was happening and knew what they would be facing. So this trip that they took went cross country. This is at a time, by the way, when, I mean, we talked about that it was amazing that these guys had survived.
Right.
You know, nobody really flew commercial in a wheelchair. It just wasn't possible. They didn't have that. This is how they had to load the guys up. As you can see, it's a, you know, like a forklift, right?
Yeah.
And then wheel them onto the airplane. So anyway, it was a big deal for them. I go into this in the book. The VA actually the head of the VA tried to stop this trip from happening. They defied the orders. They actually went all the way up to President Truman to try to get permission, and he denied them. But they said, we're going anyway. And it was a sensational tour because you had these teams, players in big arenas, and I'll show you in a second where they were playing, and they drew thousands of people. And this is at a time when very few people had ever seen somebody in a wheelchair moving around.
Right.
Here's a game they played against the Clippers, the guy about to catch the ball. That's the Boston area team from that hospital. And that was Cushing Hospital outside of, it was in Framingham, Massachusetts. They're playing the Birmingham team there. And I mean, it was a sensational time. At the same time, there's other teams starting. This is the team I mentioned, Norco, where John Winterhaller and Jerry Fessenmeyer had started. Well, here's their team. These guys were called the Rolling Devils, which I just love that name.
Yeah.
Jerry Gene, he's wearing number 1 on the far right. You can see the baby face.
No.
Yep. John Winterhaller is in the center holding the basketball there. I guess it's number 7. And you can see he's sort of rehabbed and he's got that athlete's upper body. The 2 able-bodied men, one is the coach is on the right. The gentleman on the left was a plastic surgeon. His name was Gerald Gray, Dr. Gray. He was the one who organized this team, and he and Johnny Winterhaller and even Gene had a very, very close relationship over the years. These guys, the doctors always remembered these guys. Johnny ended up working for Dr. Gray. That was his occupation. He trained as an accountant afterwards. So this is the Norco team. So they did their own road trip. They went up to San Francisco, a Bay Area. They played some of the major college teams. And then they played, you can see the Rolling Devils on the left. The gentleman on the right, where it says Bittners, that was the name of the team. It was a semi-pro team called the Oakland Bittners, one of the best amateur or semi-pro teams. And this is right before the NBA starts. And these are able-bodied basketball players. The Rolling Devils crushed them. And this was at the Oakland Civic Auditorium. So, I mean, thousands of people. And you can see the reaction. It was like people were just amazed.
Yeah.
There's the crowd there. And, they had, headlines, newspaper people. And in part, I mentioned before, World War II, the veterans, there was such big interest in these gentlemen. Everybody wanted to write about it. And I'm talking like Ladies' Home Journal, Popular Mechanics, Time and Newsweek. And you'll see, it's a little blown up there. Newsweek magazine. This is right after a game at Madison Square Garden, of all places, in New York City. And this is a gentleman named Jack Gerhardt, a veteran. He hospital on Staten Island. Jack was shot in Normandy and came back and became one of the greatest in that first generation of wheelchair basketball players, was one of the best players. They still have an award. It's called the Jack Gerhardt Award for the best player. So I mean, cover of Newsweek, where look at him. He's in the wheelchair. One of the reasons I was mentioning Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his wheelchair, when that photograph was incredibly rare. He never allowed the mainstream media to photograph him in his wheelchair, because he thought, as many did back then, that was a sign of weakness. Disability equaled weakness back then. And that photo that you saw of FDR was taken by a friend, and it was a total informal one. But he just never allowed himself to be. If you remember, after Pearl Harbor, he's standing in Congress, but he's got his big braces on and he's holding onto the lectern. So here are these guys. They have no shame about this. And in fact, it was very important for them to show the world, hey, we're here. We're not going anywhere. We're going to live a normal lifespan. So I mentioned, the team from Birmingham, which eventually became known as the Flying Wheels. Here they are when they would play the hospital team in, I guess it was Richmond, Virginia. So, by the Capitol, they would stop at the Capitol and lobby for disability rights for them. And the woman standing behind them was Congresswoman Rogers from Massachusetts, and she was a tireless advocate for veterans and veterans' rights. The GI Bill, she was in part of that effort. And a lot of these men use the GI Bill to go back to school, etc. But for these men, what they were looking to do was get some rights for paraplegia, because it is so different. So they were able to get an allowance for those the hand-controlled cars. And this was passed by Congress. They also were lobbied for successfully housing allowance, so that they could build a home that would be suitable with a wheelchair. So you would need widened doorways, right? To get from one level to, one room to the next. Your bathroom facilities need to be different for somebody in a wheelchair. You need to be able to wheel in and turn around, wheel out. Okay, maybe roll into a shower or something. So they got a housing allowance to design and build houses that would be okay for them. So this was about sports and recreation, but it was also about a bigger effort. And, their effort really, when you think about it, is eventually spreads beyond the VA. In other words, we start to see other people, not non-veterans with disabilities, going, hey, wait, if these guys can do it, what about me? I want to be part of that. And eventually women and children as well. So, but it starts with the veterans. I mentioned they would come to lobby. Well, here they are. This was a different team, 1955 or so, meeting the president, Eisenhower. And obviously he had much concern and interest in veterans, being that he was, leading them into battle. So, a lot of and I think that's very much different than maybe today and so forth, where in that era, a lot of the politicians, Truman fought in World War I. Eisenhower fought, obviously, of course, in World War II, and Nixon and Kennedy both fought as well. So you had a lot of that going on among the major politicians. Eventually, as I said, wheelchair basketball specifically, but wheelchair sports in general, gets out of the VA. And this is an effort I wanted to show. This is at the University of Illinois. And the gentleman kneeling down, he's able-bodied. He was a veteran himself. He had fought in World War II. his name is Timothy Nugent. He was, when the University of Illinois opened its doors to paralyzed students on the GI Bill mostly, Nugent organized a wheelchair basketball team that represented the university. And eventually, so it's mostly veterans, but eventually it would be those civilians who had injuries and who enrolled in the school. And Nugent was also the one to organize as all of these sort of disparate teams that were around the United States. He's the one to organize it into what's now known as the National Wheelchair Basketball Association. And he starts a tournament, an annual, national tournament that played in the biggest stadiums. And also, by the way, at Army and Navy bases, they would sometimes do the national tournaments there because they had good facilities, medical and sports and recreation facilities. So Nugent is a catalyst for taking the sport outside the VA and sort of exposing it to, just to sort of parallel to what was going on in the United States. I mentioned Dr. Ludwig Guttmann. Well, here's what they were doing in England. They eventually start playing a game called netball. And you can see it's very different. There's no backward.
Yeah, no backward.
And the rim is a lot lower. And you can look at those chairs. I mean, those are like lazy boys on wheels.
Yeah.
So Dr. Goodman, and this became really, really popular netball at Stoke Mandeville. And as I mentioned, Dr. Goodman, was the first to sort of have this idea of having teams, playing other teams in various sports. And he's the first to have the international. There was a Dutch team, a team of Dutch veterans came over. So all of a sudden, you've now got national teams. And this was growing slowly, this idea of, it was the Stoke Mandeville Games, but he was sort of paralleling it with the Olympics. But he really needed the United States to sort of solidify that this was going to be a worldwide event. And finally, like 1955, 1956, here come the United States. And this is a wheelchair basketball game. As you can see, very rough and tumble. The United States went over there. We had so much experience. We had much better wheelchairs. And eventually we sort of dominated wheelchair basketball. And Dr. Goodman changed from netball to basketball. And I guess you would say by 1960, you really have the first, what's known as the first official Paralympics, which came after the Rome Olympics in 1960. A month or so later, they had Goodman organized teams to play in Rome. It was, very small scale, but it was the start. And then 4 years later, after the Olympics in Tokyo, 1964, we have Paralympics in Tokyo. And this is the Crown Prince and Crown Princess greeting the U.S. team. And that's Dr. Goodman on the far right, by now, getting a little bit older. Mm-hmm. So that sort of traces it to sort of the modern era. My book sort of ends right around here, 1964, for various reasons. It's, the Paralympics have been launched. I do a little, 1964 is also sort of really the official, unofficial start of the Vietnam War for the U.S. I write a little bit about Vietnam and so forth. But really my focus was on the next generation, that World War II and Korean War veterans, and how they built up and used sport for rehabilitation, but also as an organizing force and a motivating force as well. And really, this is their legacy. This is a woman. She went to University of Illinois, ended up at training there. And this is at 1984, the Los Angeles Olympics. They didn't, and I go into this a little bit in the book, they didn't have the Paralympics right afterwards, but what they had were a couple of events for those in wheelchair, one for men, one for women, that came right after a day of track and field at the LA Coliseum. So this was taken at the LA Coliseum. And she was the winner of the women's event. And that's really that's sort of the legacy in a sense, that it spread beyond the VA to civilians, to amputees, and then beyond that to those with other physical disabilities, and even those with other ailments. And anyway, that's the end of the sort of presentation. But really, they were these men. I obviously salute them. I wrote this book in tribute to their sacrifice. But really, they were guinea pigs, and for science, for medical, and yet they were strong enough to endure both their physical ailments and what they had to deal with psychologically in terms of starting all over again.
Right.
And I guess last thing, I'll just sum up the three veterans' lives who I mentioned in the beginning, and then I'll shut up for a sec. And thank you for being patient with me. I sort of start rambling.
Oh, no, I'm honored. It's great.
Keep
Great
going.
stuff.
But yeah, so Stan Denadell was sort of what they considered. I mean, he went back to UCLA on the GI Bill. He was in one of the first classes to earn his MBA. He single-handedly built a home in the San Fernando Valley for he and his wife, Peg, the nurse. They adopted 2 children. A lot of the men ended up adopting children over the years. And he started working for Bank of America and spent his entire career working for Bank of America and rose up to the executive ranks.
Wow.
So he really was a success story, bar none. John Winterhaller went to school while he was at Norco. He went to school for accounting. As I said, he married his high school, college sweetheart at his hospital bed. He eventually took a job with Dr. Gray. He was the office manager for Dr. Gray's plastic surgery practice in Oakland. And they were together until Dr. Gray retired. And he would tell stories, Dr. Gray, about Johnny Winterhaller, just that he was this personality that anybody could relate to and talk to. He never stopped doing activities. There was an anecdote they told me. They all went out hunting. Dr. Gray had a lodge, had a ski lodge or something. They all went out hunting, and obviously Johnny couldn't really go very far in the wheelchair, but they put him at one of the posts, and they all went out hunting. They came back, and he had shot a deer, and the deer was right there. He was just waiting for them to come back. He and his wife also adopted 2 children, and he never, and Stan a little bit, but Johnny not so much. And this sort of went all across the board as I was able to meet other veterans' families. He never talked about this. Never talked about wheelchair basketball. Rarely talked about the war, except with other veterans.
Right.
And, we maybe looking back know them as the silent generation or something. And they really, really kept that private, maybe to save us or just because they didn't want to go through it. But certainly if you've been in a POW camp for years and it ruined, your physical being,
wow.
you probably don't want to relive that very often. And finally, Gene Jerry Fessenmeyer. He sort of took a different route in the sense of he didn't want anything to stop him from doing anything. And by that, I mean, he traveled the world. He lived in Hawaii. He lived in Mexico, lived in Southern California, lived in Texas, usually warm places. Because he went back to Iowa in his wheelchair and he found, and they had an outhouse back then. And, he's there in the middle of winter going, this isn't going to work. And so he always wanted to be in warm places. He taught himself. I mean, he always had fast cars. The interlude in Mexico is very interesting. I didn't go into it very deeply in the book. But he went, and a lot of veterans, apparently from World War II, from Korean War, and also Vietnam, they settled in Guadalajara. And they called it Quadalajara because that's how many quads and paraplegics ended up there, because it was cheaper to live. They could get nurses. They could go party and do whatever they wanted there. And they, had their pensions. And they wanted to be together. They wanted to hang out together. So that was Gene's life. And, he was still alive when I could tell him, like, hey, I'm writing this book, but he died before it was published. But that's my only regret on that. But he was an inspiration to me. I mean, when you think about it, he lived like 70 years in a wheelchair.
Wow.
And just unbelievable that spirit to just keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, this is just so inspiring in so many directions, but just a couple of Q&A here for you. You said earlier that there were about 2,500 that came home that were paralyzed. Do you know the statistics on that? Was most of those guys from the Pacifics or European, or do you have any data on that?
It was a mix. It was a mix.
A mix.
I don't know. I did not have a firm breakdown on that.
Okay.
I would think that they tended to be in the latter part of the war, when they figured out how to evacuate and do the medical care. It took them a little while.
Right.
So I think it was more from, let's say 42, so 43 on, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
And so I know that you said that you met the family of Stan and Johnny, right? They're those guys' families. What did you take away the most from that experience with them?
And just to clarify, I met one of the daughters of Stan and Adele. With the Winter Haulers, it was all by phone, even though they're in California, but we just never were able to sync up.
Yeah.
I guess what I took from them, a little bit of what I mentioned before, they didn't really talk about it. The men were very private about that part of their lives. They had written stuff down. Stan and Adele did some outreach because he was very active in disability and disability rights. So he was out there a little bit more. But I really, to the families, they would tell me, and I heard after the book was published, people would get in touch with me and say, that was my dad in that team picture that you.
Oh, wow.
That was my dad. He never told me about that. So, just odd. I thankfully, Bob Reinierson, his son and family, they had boxes and boxes of old programs and notes.
Oh, wow.
And that helped a lot. And then the PVA had a newsletter starting in 1946. So that was just invaluable resource.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what an amazing and excellent presentation. Most of my questions I wrote down, I've already marked them off because you've already covered it.
Like I said, I babbled. I'm
No, I
sorry.
love it. I love it. It's wonderful to hear all this stuff. So just kind of to shift things a little bit. So tell us about what you're doing now and how, what kind of locations people can, connect. Obviously, I think that I saw the book is on Amazon, but just kind of let us know what you would like your viewers to hear about you as far as an author and what you're doing right now.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm researching and writing the proposal for my next project, next book. So we'll see. I have I have an interest in sports photography. I'm not a photographer, but I have an interest in sports photography. So I have a long gestating project that I'm putting together. So hopefully that'll be done by the end of this year, maybe early next. And I'm hoping that somebody will pick this book up. So my previous book, just to ramble a little bit, my previous book was a biography of Kahanamoku, who was an Olympic swimmer and the godfather of surfing, this great Hawaiian figure. And that's been made into a documentary. It will be premiering this spring based on the book. I'm really hoping that somebody with some vision in the Hollywood field will pick up this book and go, you know what, this would make an amazing story.
It would be amazing. Yeah. Especially too, one of the things that I asked everybody when they come on the show is, especially veterans, and I know you're not a veteran, but, emphasizing how we can teach the generation. Like some of the kids now that are growing up, they didn't even go through 911 with us. So, I mean, it's just such a gap. And one of the quotes that I put on our podcast all the time is that the worst thing that could happen in war is not death, but to be forgotten. And so, we want to tell these stories because as long as you're telling the stories, you're keeping the history alive.
And to me, it makes total sense to try to do this. Of course, I'm biased, but I just think this would be just an inspirational story of never giving up and sacrifice and courage. And so that's my hope. Got the fingers crossed that maybe something will develop on that.
Absolutely. Are you in contact with any of the families anymore, or just kind of closed out?
Yeah, no, a little bit. Absolutely. I just try to keep them informed of, hey, if there's an appearance or something. Obviously, the book obviously has been out for a while, so it's been a little bit quieter, but I did a podcast last week and, I'm up for talking about this. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
And this is, hopefully every book I do is better than the last one, but I mean this with all my heart. I mean, this. If I don't do another book, I'm satisfied. This was an amazing story, and I'm glad that I had this experience. It taught me a lot, and I think it's the best thing I've ever done. And so,
right.
And all of that credit goes really to the veterans who showed the way. So
Wonderful.
To me, it once in a lifetime experience.
Absolutely. And we'll put, for those that want to follow you on social media, we'll put your hashtags up there and your links, and people can follow that. So, gosh, yeah, this is obviously something that we could talk about for hours. And I think you did a fantastic job with your presentation. And we just want to thank you so much for coming on the show today there, David.
And thanks for reaching out. And again, I apologize for babbling. I just keep going.
Don't apologize to me.
You've got the edit button. You got it.
More Than Just a Veteran is currently seeking heroic veteran stories to share. For more information on how to submit your story or support our podcast, go to www.morethanjustaveteran.com. More Than Just a Veteran is owned and produced by Presco Productions. Like us on Facebook and Instagram at More Than Just a Veteran. God bless you all, and let us never forget that freedom is not free. This podcast is dedicated to the beloved CW03 Lionel W. Lanou, laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, Arlington, Virginia.